Not recording. There we go. So good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me. It is Eileen. It is April 24th and today we are going to talk about short stories. So I have a couple things to kind of get us started with, but I first with Bonnie before we jumped in, and she was talking that you have struggled. Did you kind of want to summarize what you were saying there, Bonnie? How stories have left you feeling?
So as a reader of short stories, I find myself left unsatisfied a lot. And I feel like I don't really understand the genre. And as a writer, I also feel like it's not the same as anything else. And I sometimes feel like it's even harder to write a short story than it is to write a poem. And in a weird way, not really harder to understand, but harder to feel satisfied at the end of a short story for me, for many of them, and certainly more contemporary ones, I would say, is where the divide, older, more classical ones, where there's transformation from beginning to end with the main character, I'm more able to feel a sense of satisfaction. But often short stories feel like they just end arbitrarily, or that nothing has really happened to transform the character in any discernible way to me.
I'm curious. Yeah, other people. Leslie, you've chosen to write a short story. What appeals to you about short stories? You're muted, Leslie, so we can't hear a thing you're saying.
I can finish them quickly. When I'm stuck on the long process, I'm like, I just want to finish something. And Bonnie, I can recommend a really fabulous short story mechanics class because what the instructor who I've taken many classes with says is that every story, no matter how long, there needs to be a narrative arc, and there actually needs to be character change, even though it may be tiny. So that may be, maybe the stories you've read are not nailing that part of it. I mean, I guess there are some horror stories where it's just bad to worse, but so he really drilled that into me. There has to be a little bit of a change of some kind in that short story for it to be satisfying.
And I think you'll find actually a lot of variation on that because I took a short story class and his thrust is it did not need to have the same narrative arc. Wow. And that in fact, the core of any short story is about emotion. Oh. And that you have to demonstrate emotion on the screen. And I do think that's a leaning towards what we might think of as more literary short story fiction. I certainly do very much see in genre short stories. So we talked a little bit, Bonnie was talking about reading collections. Mm-hmm. And I always think that's very interesting because I tend to most years, I get the best American short stories. Mm-hmm. And it's a collection of short stories that is pulled together by a guest editor each year. And each year it changes. And so I find it really interesting that depending who the guest editor is, I can almost tell if I'm going to like the short stories that they pull together. Mm-hmm. Just because I find authors who tend to write more commercial fiction, even if it's bridging, like Barbara Kingsolver did it one year. And the short stories that she chose very much had that narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay. It may be, just a moment in time. It may just be, over the course of a coffee date, but there was still some sort of arc and change, a clear character motivation that I could identify. And then I have read other collections where there were some stories that I quite enjoyed or left me with an emotional feeling. But if you asked me to describe what they were about, I really would have struggled with that.
I find that with some of the CBC stories.
Yes. And I would think that they would go with that. So I just think it's useful to spend a few minutes just to sort of talk about what we mean when we say short story. So typically most short stories are under 8,000 words. Mm-hmm. You might have heard the term microfiction. I don't know if anyone knows that term, or shorts, and that can be as low as 500 words. Mm-hmm. So you will see those really things. And then once you start talking about a long short story, sometimes you'll hear novelette. Is around 20,000 words, and then novellas are usually around 30,000 words. So just to kind of give people sort of a ballpark. If you're hoping to publish short stories, the market has changed a lot. Mm-hmm. So initially, the short story market was one of the biggest places. And there were tons of magazines and various publications that were seeking out short stories. And that was often, for lack of a better term, a gateway drug for a lot of writers. So they would publish short stories, and then they would sort of move from short stories moving into novels. So one thing I did want to sort of make sure everyone knew is that don't get hung up on, if you find that you write novels really well and you enjoy that kind of longer piece of work, don't worry about that if that becomes what you want to do and you don't want to do shorter fiction. Like, some people find that they just don't enjoy writing short stories. I went through a period where I felt like I had to write short stories because I thought that was the only way I was going to get published. So I tried doing a whole bunch of short stories, and certainly, again, having taken creative writing when in university, most of what we were doing in those classes was short stories, but it's probably not my favorite medium. I tend to prefer a little bit longer. So really, I mean, I think one of the trick is, it's right there in the title that short story is short, which means you're going to have to make some fundamental decisions at the beginning about what is the scope of that story. How many characters can you reasonably have in that story? How many plot lines can you have? And in most cases, you're going to need to narrow that down. So you're going to need to really drill down into what you're doing with a short story. You know, going with the big guys. So if you talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald, he did a thing on short stories, and I think this is where my teacher got it, is he said, you have to find the key emotion. If you have a key emotion, you have all that you need. So I do think it is useful to take a moment and sort of ask yourself at the stop of something, what is the heart of the story that you're trying to tell? What is the emotion that you would like to leave the reader with? So I want to go back over to Leslie. You wrote a short story. Do you want to just briefly describe what your short story is about, and then maybe tell us a little bit about in terms of what emotion you wanted to have with that?
Am I unmuted? Yes, I am.
Yes.
This was my second round entry for the New York City Flash contest, where I had a prompt of the genre was ghost story, and the setting was it? So I got ghost story, butler, and paralysis. So I had to come up with a 2,000 word story for that. And for the really longest time, right up until the last day, I was stuck. I couldn't write anything. And then I always start around a vision. And I had a vision of this woman on a ferry going to look like the Atlantic coast. I'm like, oh, Nantucket's haunted. I'll write about Nantucket. And that's how the story started. So I had those definitive prompts that I had to use. And I tend to write a lot about women finding themselves and finding hope and believing in themselves and starting over. And so it kind of turned into a love story. So that's where it came from.
And I think that is really interesting. And we're going to cycle back to that, Leslie, when we get into your story, because I do think it is fundamentally a love story. And despite the fact that it is a ghost story, I don't think it is really meant to be creepy. So it'll be quite interesting when we go through, because as I was reading, I was initially thinking, okay, this should be a ghost story. And so you'll see places where I'm like, maybe this needs to be creepier. And I ended up taking out some of those comments and thinking more about having maybe a sense of unease, being a little bit different. But definitely, you know, when you're thinking about short story, thinking a little bit about what is the emotion that you're trying to do. And again, because I do like transition, whether or not you want to clearly show a transitional emotion. So a character who comes perhaps feeling helpless or lost and leaves feeling that they've found a direction, or whatever that is that you're trying to kind of demonstrate that you want to do. So thinking about that, thinking about how much you can, again, get into. So having read Leslie's story, this is a character who has experienced grief and loss. And there are all kinds of things that you could get into, like in terms of how long were they married and what was the backstory of the marriage and all these, what did he die of and how is she doing and all those kinds of things. But you'll see that I don't think that any of that is actually important to the story because, again, we're dealing with a compact space to sort of deal with all of that. Oddly enough, one of the things I had a question about, which I think thankfully doesn't need to be in there, is I had a question, one of the characters is paralyzed. And so one of my questions was like, not sure why the paralysis is important, other than it sort of shows his backstory that he might be struggling a little bit. But I had a question about whether or not we should take that out, which we can now promptly ignore because it needed to be in there for the prompt. And it doesn't work that he isn't, I mean, there's no reason that he shouldn't be paralyzed, other than, again, because it's short fiction, and that seemed like such a key thing to be involved with a character. I wondered if we were opening up doors that we didn't necessarily need to get into. So that is one thing to go with. All right. Any questions so far in terms of that? Okay. Bonnie, looks like you have
one. I just wanted to, so when you say that about going back to Fitzgerald, there only needs to be an emotion, like an emotion that you come away with. And yes. Like you just have to be like happy, sad, angry, disturbed, something like scared. That's it, and that's all that you need.
Yeah, Fitzgerald would say that what you are trying to do is elicit an emotional response in the reader. That they're not necessarily, again, looking for a full and complete story. And I wonder if you think about some of the short stories that you may not have enjoyed in the past or found frustrating. I definitely find it frustrating when there is not some kind of transition that's happening. So I'm going to argue my personal preference, which is I like to see both. I like to see something that is a transitional thing, which also has a clear beginning, middle, and end. I remember the first time I read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which is, I think, pretty much required reading in any English lit class that you have. And I just remember that moment when you realized what the lottery really was. And it was like, oh, and I was, shocked. And I went back and read the story again right away from sort of beginning and, all the way through. And it does have a strong emotional pull, but it also has a very clear thing about what happens. So I still find that those types of stories tend to appeal to me more. Or if I'm reading a short story collection, I tend to enjoy collections that tend to be more focused sometimes in a genre. Even if it's the genre I don't necessarily read. So I've read Mary Robinette, who I think many of you know. She's a good friend of mine. I'm generally not a science fiction person. I don't read very much of it. But I've read quite a bit of her short stories because I like her as a writer. And so I find, as a result, she'll sometimes forward on to me a collection, and I'll end up reading a few more of them because I find the short stories in a science fiction collection tend to be, again, much more genre focused. So they tend to be more clear to narrative arc going through. Other questions on that? The other thing certainly that I'm going to advise if you're looking at short stories is looking to have some kind of hook that you don't have a lot of time to work with. So you're going to want to figure out how you're going to pull that reader in, and even more so than a novel, although I'm going to harp on it, is thinking about your opening line and what is it that you can do in that opening? Because again, when I'm going through a short story collection, I'm, if anything, even more harsh than I am with a book, that I'll read a couple lines, and if I don't find myself captivated, or if it's not an author that I know that I want to read, then I do it. So Marianne, when you talk about the hate ship, friendship, love ship, marriage, which is kind of an awesome title, how long of a story was that?
Very long for a short story. And from my perspective, I have not read that many, but it almost felt like, I don't know, like the length of 6 or 7 chapters in a novel. Like there were whole, definite whole acts to it, and quite a wide range of emotions elicited in the reader in relation to the protagonist and her position in the world and all the people around her. So it was a whole, and I don't know what my takeaway was, except kind of awe.
Not a bad takeaway. I think that I would take that.
It's like, wow, no wonder she's famous. But No, it was kind of like and this is the thing, when I read a really good short story, I think, oh, how did they do that so quickly? And that's why I can't write them, because I just can't. But
if you can check and see who the
pulled
author is.
along by the nose hairs, by these little tiny things that twist and shift, and you get so many things about so many characters, and you relate to them either through pity or through disgust.
Strong emotion.
Yeah, strong emotions. But then you end up feeling kind of like this vindication, because she's made you relate so powerfully to this underdog who ends up. So there's this huge power inversion, and you can't even, and it's almost like random things happen, but it also kind of has this inherent commentary about all of life encapsulated in this little tiny.
Well, and I think that is the challenge for people to do within a short story, and thinking about that. And I think Marianne's talking about, I think, a market that has definitely, again, opened up with the online things happening with Amazon, is you are seeing increasingly people looking for shorts. And shorts is just so poorly defined, because you will see things that are short, and you'll see things that are, sort of borderline novella length. And Amazon, of course, is looking at different price points and so forth, but you're seeing people do that. And I think it's filling the market that used to be present, because there used to be so many magazines and various things that were, short stories that came out, and those pretty much have died off. Although you are seeing them kind of revising a little bit now more as e-zines and those kinds of things. So that market, and then also people looking at Amazon and putting things up there as a place to sort of sell and market that. And I think what has surprised a lot of people is that it's selling. Not surprising, not that he needs the money in any way, shape, or form, but I got an email recently from Amazon where I saw that Stephen King has unbundled quite a few of his short stories. So if you've ever read his short story collections that he used to come out with, he's now unbundled them, and you can buy them individually on Amazon.
For 99 cents?
Yeah, they have like the novella lengths, which I think were $2 and something. And then, but so it was these individual, which I thought was quite interesting, because of course he initially sold most of those short stories, and he of course continues to sell short stories because he's Stephen King, in a lot of various markets that I don't think are open to the rest of us. But I find it he's a very good short story writer. And if you haven't read his short stories, I'd actually encourage you to give them a look. Often they're not scary. I know some people are like, well, I don't like horror. But he's actually a very good short story writer, and some of those are really well worth looking at. So basically, again, you're going to want a strong hook to start. And I think you're going to want to have some kind of strong ending, and then keeping the focus on what the emotion is. So now I'm going to take us over to, hang on here, Leslie's short story. And we'll talk through my notes. And Leslie, you can unmute yourself and interrupt me at any point if you want to change or clarify something that I'm saying. So let me share my screen. So you guys can see that, I hope? Nodding? Okay. So the title, of course, leads me to believe it's going to be a ghost story. Because the clever title is There Once Was a Ghost from Nantucket.
That's a working title, by the way. That was for the New York City content.
But you know what I kind of like, and this is a thing where I wanted to think about with tone, is There Once Was a Ghost from Nantucket. Makes me think it's going to be humorous. Like that was the first initial thought that I had. Hang on, I got chat windows going here too. So I was wanting to know kind of what that was, and then it doesn't really deliver on being humorous. Like that's not one of the funnies that kind of comes out.
It's a placeholder.
It's a placeholder. So thinking about tone, I might change that. Although for the record, if someone was going to write a humorous ghost story, There Once Was a Ghost from Nantucket is an excellent title, and Leslie may allow you to steal it, depending how she's feeling about that. So again, the very first thing that I want to do is I want to look at that first line. And so for you, Leslie, you have the choppy waves toss the ferry back and forth as we approach the shore. So for me, what I take away from that is that this is going to be a story about someone whose life is upended and is uncertain. Sorry, hacking up something there. She sets up the setting right away. They're off to Nantucket, all of those kinds of things. One of the things I noticed is you had a lot of short paragraphs that were often just one sentence paragraphs, Leslie. And I ended up suggesting potentially bundling those up together. And I know you've been doing some revisions. And part of that is because I want, when you do have one that stands alone, that you get a lot of bang for the buck. So what you have here is, for people who are kind of trying to read along as I skim through quickly, is we have a woman on a boat. She's coming to Nantucket because she's had a dream. It's now the 2nd anniversary of Danny's death. So she thinks perhaps Danny's in fact even sent her this dream. All those kinds of things. And then there's the line, this dream though is too vivid to ignore. So I would want that broken out. And when the other paragraphs above that are also broken out, I think you lose the oomph of that particular line. So that's why I would change that. And then we actually go into the dream. I'm going to suggest that you say, in it, I'm striding down a cobblestone street, because I actually wondered at this point if she had gotten off the boat and was actually in fact walking. So just to make it clear, so if you are ever, and we talked about this when we talked about backstory, if you're ever doing backstory or having a moment where you have kind of a flashback, or in this case where you have someone talking about the dream that they're having, making sure that there's some sort of either transitional line, so in it, or I remember the dream, or something like that, that should make sure that the reader is clear where they are, or putting something all in italics. So that's the other sneaky trick that you can use if you want to. So this character has a dream where she's going down to this particular cobblestone street. She sees a clapboard place, the Magnolia House bed and breakfast, wheelchair accessible, and then she wakes up once she goes through the door. And that alone has sort of led her to go to Nantucket, the island of her ancestors and so forth. So here she stands. I loved this description. Auburn curls turned to a bird's nest as they were kind of going through the wind, kind of described that really well. I found this a little odd. So few inns are open this time of year. And although I haven't booked a room, I'm strangely unconcerned. And maybe that's just my personal thing, but I find it a little odd that she would go off to Nantucket and have no idea where she was going to stay and potentially be trapped on an island. Did anyone else, any thoughts on that?
So my assumption is that if you go to a tourist destination in the off season, that there will be lots of accommodation available.
Yeah, and so yeah, maybe it's, again, it's just me, but I think it's partly because ferries stop running at a certain point. So
yes. You know, I mean, people still live on Nantucket. The ferries don't stop.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I'm assuming like if you got over there, you could potentially not find a place to stay, and then what do you do?
Well, I wanted that to be weird because she should be worried, but she's not. So I wanted that to be part of the setup, that why isn't she worried? She's showing up in the sign, doesn't know where she's going.
So she wanders along the street, she climbs up, and then she finds this place that's been in her dream. And like, I think that's kind of like, there is this moment where I almost want her to have a little bit extra of a awe, like, because it's not just like a place with the same door. It is the exact same sign that she saw in her dream. So I think that would have a moment of even bigger weirdness or uncertainty, because again, it's not just like, if it's like if her dream is there's a place with a blue door and she somehow instinctively knows it's an inn, and then she gets to Nantucket and there's a place with a blue door that has a Magnolia Inn sign, that would be unnerving, I think. But I don't know if it would have the same oomph as like, this is exactly the place I saw in my dream, and I've never been to Nantucket before. Leslie.
So I had a little bit of feedback, and they said to take out that reaction so that the reader has it instead. So I took it out.
So yeah, I think those are just things to sort of think about that. And I don't know if you saw Mary Ann's comment in the chat window, like the same way of her sense that she's not concerned about what happens next. So it's that thing where, because you have the line, like, I'm scrolling back, sorry. I'm strangely unconcerned. Like maybe even just adding a line like, I'm at a stage in my life where it just doesn't matter, or like it's just going to work itself out, or just one other line around that, I think would kind of do that for me. So she finds this magnolia house. She steps inside. And there's a line like, does she have a reservation anyplace else? And it's wheelchair accessible. And again, you'll see later, I was like, does it matter that it's wheelchair accessible? Like she seems to have noticed that. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily pull that out unless I either knew someone in my family who had a disability that I might make a special notice of it. But if you asked me, like I just booked a hotel for my trip in June. And if you said to me, does the place in Paris, is it wheelchair accessible? I don't think I would have any idea, because I don't need that accessibility. No one I'm traveling with needs that accessibility. So I didn't notice whether or not it was there. So the fact that she notices it does two things. One, it makes me think it's going to be important to the short story. And two, it does hammer home the idea that this is part of her dream. So she goes inside. There's a woman inside who's like the perfect innkeeper for someone in Nantucket. So she's got her hair up in a bun, all those kinds of things. She's going to help her. There's a room available. Nice line. It's November, my dear. All my rooms are available. So she's very excited to sort of be there. I like that she's not going to share her dream. So she kind of looks around the place. It's a beautiful place. Talks about her family. The first visit to the family. She says, Nantucket's one of the most haunted places in the country. There's no need to be afraid if you see something you can't explain. Most of our guests are a friendly sort. I wonder, like, if that would make her at all uneasy. Or like, and then depending on the tone that you want to have. So, and again, part of this might just be how you're reading it. But like, if I picture the innkeeper being this old lady who says, well, then I should probably warn you, Nantucket's one of the most haunted places in the country. Like where I would be like, okay, you weirdo. Or is it like a laughing, joking, because it's going to have like a bit of an unsettled thing for the reader? Or is it like a little bit of excitement? Because in some ways, when you start the story off with that her husband has passed away, I'm thinking that her husband might be the ghost that she's going to see. So I didn't know if part of her was hoping that she would see a ghost, and that, maybe she would finally be visited by the ghost of Danny. So just wanting to have a little bit of a sense of how she feels in that moment. Again, when she has the line, like, I wouldn't be afraid, I'd love to meet a ghost. I was wanting to know, like, is she scared at all, or is she actually excited about that? Does she hope it'll be with Danny? Any of those kinds of things. You have a couple dialogue lines that start with well. I always point at my screen as if you can see me pointing. But she says, well, then I should probably warn you. And then just a few paragraphs later, she says, well, no need to fret. So one thing I wanted to highlight this for everybody, because it is a verbal tick. Most of us do this when we're talking. We'll say, well, I was going to go here. Well, those kind of things. You can hear me already, Leslie. So one, I do leave them in if I want to really show that the character is pausing, because we do it as kind of, instead of an or an which is also just a verbal hiccup basically, but we'll be like, well, I was going to go to dinner here. But if you want to show sort of hesitation, you might want the well in there. So you might be like, well, and you're trying to show that the character maybe doesn't completely want to say the next line. But when you are in a short story or just in general trying to tighten your prose, well is a really good word to do an auto search for to figure out whether or not you need it. And in most cases, you can cut it. In fact, in both of these lines, if you look, you don't have to have them in there. I should probably warn you, Nantucket's one of the most haunted places, or no need to fret. Like the well doesn't actually add anything. And so I just also wanted to highlight that as well. The next line is also my question around what do you want to have for tone or feel? So the woman says it's $79 per night. You get all meals plus refreshments each afternoon between 3 and 6. And I just thought, like, that's darn cheap. All meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, plus a room, like for $79. And so again, part of me started wondering if this whole place was haunted. And then in fact, Scott's nodding, like that this is from another time and it's like 1960s. And so she's still charging 1960s rates. So one thing to think about is how low do you want the rate to be? Because she has a line here where she says like, thank you, thrilled for the cheap rate. Whereas I'm imagining if I called, as I did, places in Paris and someone said, oh yes, it's $79 for the night and you get all your meals plus some afternoon refreshments, I would be like, they're either feeding me dog meat or they're going to sell me into white slavery or something else is going, like I would think it was too good of a deal and that would almost unnerve me. So I guess the part of the question is, how much do you want to highlight? And I think part of that is the detail. So one thing is, all of our rooms are available. As you can see, she said, holding out the rate cards. The rooms include all the meals, etc. And you could ever just be like, I'm thrilled with the low tourist rate. So, but by mentioning a particular price point, I wonder whether or not it's important for me to notice that. And particularly in short stories where we really tend to drill down, where I think, and I find it interesting that Scott nodded as well, so I'm not alone in this. I was 100% convinced that she was a ghost because the 79, and I'll buy $89 for a breakfast buffet, but she says all meals. So we're talking lunch, dinner, plus they give them wine and like snacks in the afternoon. Like it just seemed such a good deal as to be from a different time. And
I don't think I get out much. I just picked a random number. And it was off season, right? I'll work on that.
So yeah, like, so, and maybe I stay at too expensive a place, like, but I would have a sense of unease, but I don't think you need the actual rate in there. Just so that people aren't necessarily potentially bumping on that. So she signs in, she gets this beautiful room, there's some nice descriptions of the room. So she goes downstairs, she goes outside, she's sort of sitting here. It's beautiful, nice description. There's the gulls. The tension I've carried in my shoulder since forever, it seems. I didn't know if you wanted a line there about maybe like for the last 2 years or so, like, is this something that she has always been unhappy and tense? Or, I had the sense that maybe this is her now finally, and I almost wanted a bit more here. So I'm scrolling up for just a second. Like she has this line, I see it's 5 o'clock, enough time to enjoy the promised refreshments and possibly figure out what has brought me to this place. And again, when we talk about having a goal, like I almost wonder if part of this is she's following this dream and she doesn't know why she's there because she had the dream, but that she feels she needs to do something to mark, like it's now been 2 years. I know that it's time to move on. I just haven't been able to. That her purpose in going, even though she doesn't know exactly what it's going to be, it's not like I'm going to go there and go on the beach and burn his photos or, but like I'm following this dream and then I have to find some way to let go. I need to, move on. I need to do this and I don't know how to do that. And I think by then saying, this tension that she's been carrying, forever, it seems, but it's really only been 2 years. Or even a line about grief is one of those weird things, right? Like, so you see some people who remarry 2 months after a spouse dies and some people who never remarry. And, just kind of where she is in that grief process, where maybe she really does feel like she has grieved and she is ready to move on, but she just doesn't know exactly how to do it yet. How to kind of do that. But, you know, that she's finding that she's less lost each and every day. So she's sitting on this, you know, beautiful porch. There's these lovely propane heaters. And then all of a sudden this butler basically shows up, you know, good afternoon. And he has this sort of, you know, complete tray and all those kinds of things. And he's impeccably dressed in an old-fashioned tuxedo. So again, my spidey senses as a reader are twinging, where I'm like, I'm betting this guy's not real. Or at least that's going to be a suspicion that I have, because I know that it is a ghost story. So I'm waiting for a ghost to show up, and he's showing up in an old-fashioned tuxedo. And I think that she would have just a little bit of a moment like, even like, just that's weird, or like, my gosh, they take the formality here really to the nth degree. Like, has this guy been waiting? Because there's no other guests in the place. Like, was this guy just like upstairs in jeans, you know, having a cigarette, and then all of a sudden the owner was like, we've got a guest, and he had to pull on his tuxedo. So I think she would have a moment where she would just sort of acknowledge a little bit of the oddness of that. And then she has some nice trays. And she does have it, because she has a line where she says later here, you know, good heavens, I can't believe they have a butler. I stare at his pristine gloves, taken back by his formal appearance. But just one beat more about, was this guy just waiting for me to show up? Like, we're talking a guy full into white gloves. If I'm the only person staying there, like, I would be shocked that the guy did that for me. Does that make sense? So he pours tea. This is my dream come true. High tea while looking at the ocean. So she has these lovely sandwiches. This is where, again, where she talks about letting the tensions release. And that's, again, where I wanted almost a bit of like, this is her letting go, like, just, again, why she's there. Because she's come for a purpose. Like, part of it's just to follow the dream and see what happens. But part of it is, of course, also to do something else. So then there's basically someone who comes up for her. There's a wheelchair that comes behind her with someone who's got white wine and fruit and so forth. And you have the line, the reason for the wheelchair ramp is now clear. Would she automatically assume that he worked here versus he was another guest? And then another thing for you to consider, and I'm ruining the story for other people here, so close your ears for just a second. Is he at all thrown that she has a pot of tea and sandwiches? Like, is he going to wonder where she got those from?
He can't see them.
Ah, all right.
So yeah, I have to figure out a way to yeah, it was clear in my mind, obviously not yours.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't at the moment. Like, I just thought he was bringing more snacks. But then later when we, you know, we're going to discover, you know, spoiler alert for others, that the butler is in fact a ghost. I wondered, like, when I went back, you know, oh, okay. You already have a pot of tea and all this kind of stuff. And where would you get it if it was in fact his job to bring it out to her? So he says, you know, mom says he has a guest. He's a little bit rude to her, but she has a little sparkly feelings, you know, about him. She finds there's something about him sort of interesting. He hands her the snacks. Again, you'll see there's a few places where I often will take out dialogue tags, particularly if we're trying to really tighten things up. So I take it surprised by my, you know, trembling hands. I love that little detail. And you had, thank you, I say. I place both the glass and the plate on the table. You can take out the say, because it's clear that she's the one saying it, particularly because they are the only two people in the room as this scene is happening. And it buys you another 2 words. And again, sometimes when you are looking at having to fit a short story into something particularly tight, those are the places where I look to see, if I take out a dialogue tag, can I replace it with an action that will give me more bang for buck? So the fact that she's sort of balancing the glass and the plate besides the tray of sandwiches, those kinds of things, which again makes me think that that plate and everything is really there. So I was more convinced that there was a tray, and I wondered if he would say anything. So off he goes. And then our butler kind of swoops back in. And I like this because I think it's like he startles me with his stealth. Good heavens, he must have been a cat burglar in another life. One, I just think that's nice for tone. But again, as the reader, I'm quite sure all of our readers who are, knowing we're having a ghost stories, your spidey tenses as something again are going like, what's going on there? So she actually invites him to sit down, and he actually does. And he, she asked me, have you been working here? He says, you could say that, yes. You must enjoy the job to still be working at your age. And I just pointed out there was an echo of age in there, so I got that to get rid of. So they're having this, kind of thing. He says, there's no denying the truth. I am much older than you might believe. Does she find that at all uneasy? And again, I think it's just thinking about what's the tone. Like, again, for me, I'm definitely twinging that he's a ghost at this point. So I guess it's whether or not you want any of that to still be uncertain to the reader, or if you want the reader to be in it at this point and she's the only one who doesn't know. So that's something to consider. The other thing that I thought about is you have made a point to say that she has family that's from Nantucket. And then he starts talking about, it's over 200 years, built by a family who made their living in shipping. Whether or not you wanted us to believe that this is a ghost from her family. Because that is an assumption that I do end up making, that those two things are going to be connected.
And that's what I want you to think.
Yeah.
That's why she thinks he's familiar somehow.
Yeah. So then she wants to read about the history of the place, and he tells her, you can go down to the library, all this kind of stuff. She never knows his name. He shakes her hand. I love this line, and not all ghost stories are tragic. Sometimes the dead linger simply because of powerful love of a place they can't bear to leave. So at this point, as the reader, I am now 100% convinced that Jeffrey is the ghost and that he has a purpose here. Which again is fine. It's just making sure that you know that you have it. I want to flag this line because it's going to be important later, as he says, in my experience, some people need a little push to discover what they truly need. Then he asks her what happens. She says, I tell all about my husband's death in a fiery car crash. I'm not sure she would describe it as fiery, just because it's her husband that died in it. And I probably would want to not think about that part of it at all. But, maybe it's her soon-to-be ex-husband and she's kind of glad he went out in a pile of flames. I'm not going to judge that at all, but I don't have that sense. So he talks about young Jonathan, who is, in fact, the other person, that he's, in fact, a writer. He writes under a pen name. And she's kind of shocked. It happens to be the book that she's brought along. He's one of her favorite authors. And he says, you might call that an unusual coincidence. And I want to know if she thinks it's particularly odd. Like, she's a bit overwhelmed by the oddness of the entire situation. But again, I'm just thinking for myself, I've had a dream. I dreamed of a particular place. I show up in Nantucket. There's a place that is exactly the place that I pictured. And the person who happens to be one of the owners happens to be my absolute favorite author. That would feel like more than a bit of a coincidence. I would be wanting to feel like what was happening there.
So just another beat of emotion in there?
Yes.
Okay.
So she's exhausted. Off she goes to bed. She wakes up. There's been a gift left, or she's had a dream, of a woman with a kind face in a floor-length dress of soft periwinkle. Not elaborate or formal. This was simple in design, like a dress from the past. I might just clarify how long in the past, just because I was trying to figure out 1970s or...
I just cut that whole entire line.
Oh, well then we don't even need to worry about it. So let's just skim on. So she's sitting in the dream. She drags herself out. She gets here for a shower. She comes out. And there's a package for her on the end table. And it seems to me a little bit off because the door is still locked. And she's like, the package must have been here from yesterday. I don't think she would think that. because the room's not that big. Like I would notice a package wrapped on the desk table. I would definitely notice it. So I think that would be something that she would know. And so I almost would be maybe a little bit unnerved because there's a tag on it. So it's got her name on it. You know, my goodness, they go above and beyond for their guests. But I might be a little bit unnerved because like they came into the room when I was in the shower, right? So I was in the shower and then they came in there like I, you know, I understand small towns, but it would just give me that little bit of uncomfortable feeling because what, you know, or maybe it's just me, I would have come out of the shower butt-ass naked because I don't always necessarily dress in the bathroom. And then that could have been a really interesting moment with my newest. So she unwraps the gift. It's a blouse. And it's this beautiful blouse all embroidered and it's exactly in her size. And she says, impressive. Impressive or a little weird. Like, I didn't know if I would have a moment where I was like, again, and maybe because I'm twinging, like, not only is it $79 a night, but they've also given me a custom made shirt and they somehow know what size I wear. Like, did they go through my clothing when I was on the porch? Or I would be a little bit unnerved by that. So then she's going to go down and have breakfast. She goes down, she's wearing this. Does she feel a little bit uncomfortable because he's having breakfast? So Jonathan is there at the breakfast table. And I know sometimes at bed and breakfast, you all sit at the same table. And sometimes you might be the only person and someone else is the only person, but you're still eating at separate tables. So I just wondered if she feels a little bit awkward or uneasy to that. Interesting question too from Scott, like, is there any kind of smell to the shirt? So something for her to think about. So she's sitting down, the woman bustles in, she's making her breakfast, she's sitting next to Jonathan. Again, she's sort of intrigued. She has some tingly feelings about Jonathan. She's going back in to have the scone. I wondered, like, she's kind of like, she's looking at him like, I'm wondering if she's wanting to kind of be like, I know who you are. Like, there'd be that awkward feeling, like she knows who he is as an author, that kind of thing. So she's not so sure. So they're talking. One thing is, like, he touches, which is a very old-fashioned thing to do. He actually raises her hand and kisses her hand to greet her. And again, given that her husband has died 2 years ago, I wondered how much she's been touched. So if you've ever lost someone in your life, like, one of the weird things is, you know, if you're married or whatever, you're hugging someone, you're sleeping next to them, you're kissing them all the time. And then if that person is no longer in your life, you suddenly have the awareness of how rarely you might touch other people. And in fact, I was talking to someone and she made a comment. She was like, I don't think I've hugged anyone in a year. And it's just that intimate human touch. So I just wondered if she would have a moment of that. Then just a moment, ooh, there we go. She gets a little, you know, kind of verklempt with this. And he says, are you okay? And he places a warm hand on her shoulder. Is she still standing or has she sat down?
In the revised version, she sits beside him.
Okay. Because I was like, if he's in a wheelchair and she's standing, like, it just seemed like it would be an odd movement to make. So they have breakfast. And then I said here, I didn't know how long he had been dead. I had to go back. So maybe even just commenting again, like, she haven't had this reaction to a man before, not even my husband. Or maybe it's because it must be the sea air or the fact he's been gone for 2 years. Like, I think she would chalk it up to more, like, he's also her favorite author. Like, I can see having tingly feelings like this. I had this weird dream and I came here and then there's this guy here and he's someone that I admire. And yeah, like, I'm fangirling a little bit because, you know, writers are sexy hot beasts. And so, you know, of course there's that going on. So, you know, he mentions the blouse and she's like, well, you know, I didn't give you a gift. And the woman's like, well, maybe Jeffrey gave it to me. And the owner's like, who's Jeffrey? And it's like, well, the butler. And Maggie's like, you know, what are you talking about? We certainly don't have a butler. Jonathan goes pale. They have a discussion. he asks what brought her to the thing. So she sort of tells him this. And he says, well, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but I happen to write fiction. And she says, yes, Jeffrey told me. And then he says, okay, you have to read my book. He goes and gets her an advanced reader copy of his new book, which isn't even out yet. So she couldn't have known about it. And on the back of it, you'll see what's going on. So he offers her the book, and the book is about a young widow who has a recurring dream that sends her to the island of Nantucket. When she meets the ghosts of her ancestors, her past and future collide, bringing the peace she's seeking along with a new chance for love. So this book that he just wrote is all obviously about her and them and the two of them. That's impossible. And then, of course, she turns around and she sees Jeffrey behind her, and he's there, and he whispers just a little push, and vanishes into a cloud of dust motes that swirl and dance. So I just love the echo of the line from earlier, just a little push. That just made it perfect. And then, who is the woman in the dated dress? So I just never knew who that was. So I just wasn't sure if we needed her to have all of that. Because I was like, well, is there another ghost then? Is there two ghosts who are trying to push them together? Or how is that working? Just because she does have that dream. So that is my thoughts on your short story. And I will be sending it back to you. Does anyone else have anything that they want to chime in about short stories in general or about Leslie's short story in particular? Tick tock, tick tock. Leslie, any questions for me?
No, I'm trying to think how I had that woman. Those are her great grandparents.
Yeah.
I did originally have in there that she was a seamstress, but I cut that because I need to cut words. And I wanted a reason for her to bring up the butler at breakfast about this gift that she got. So I didn't know how else to do it. I'd like to cut her because I still need to cut almost 300 words, but, and there's 400 words cut out of this already. So I don't know.
So I might cut out, because the blouse for me was a tiny bit creepy. And also if the blouse is real, why isn't the teacup real?
Yes, true. So how can maybe she can just bring up the high tea or something at breakfast?
Or maybe there's flowers on the dress or on the dresser, and she doesn't bring them down, but she thanks them for the flowers. And they're like, we didn't put flowers in your room.
Right. So maybe she can see them.
Maybe
I like that.
Flowers.
That's got to be at least 200 words.
And and then I might not worry about the old lady in the dream.
Yeah, just cut her
you
out.
can just get it. Yeah.
Yes, I like it.
So there we go. We got rid of her. All right. Well, I will be sending this back to Leslie, but I did want to jump back. Bonnie had a question at the very beginning of this about she has written, well, actually, Bonnie, I'll let you do it. You've written your 10,000 words for the Nano Summer, and you're kind of wondering next steps. Is that it?
Yeah, because, wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Because I didn't really end up writing a novel out. I really just wrote notes. I mean, there is a thin thread of an arc in there somewhere of the story, but what I really did was write a bunch of notes. It's historical fiction. So what I've done so far is I've pulled out all the questions I need answered research-wise. So I could just go off now and do that and just do the research, which is a fine thing, I guess. But I just wondered if there was anybody had any other thoughts about what I might be doing. A lot of the problem is I let myself go ahead and write ideas for scenes and motivations and conflicts without any idea if historically in the time period, in the situation, that those things were real. So I feel a little bit like I don't really want to write anymore until I know what will work, because I suspect a bunch of it isn't really true, and I'll have to figure out another way that's more realistic.
So I'll let other people chime in if they have thoughts, but when I've done kind of that big dump where I have a whole bunch of things on the page, I do the first thing you did, which is pull out and set up some way to figure out what are the areas where I had questions. So for you, where's the areas that I need to do research? And then I also go back and kind of almost outline bullet point form, what are the scenes that I think need to be there? So do I have an outline of a story? So do I have an inciting event? Do I have a midpoint? Are there points that are missing? And again, depending, like in your case, since there's research you want to do, I would probably then go off and do the research and then go back to the outline and figure out what needs to be changed and what's missing. But it's just kind of a way to make sure I still have those story points, or as you talked about, like the beginning of that thread. Marianne's got a comment for you as well, like thinking about, you know, what's the character arc, which, you know, kind of in some ways goes back to what we were talking about with the short story thing, but what is the transformation that you want to show, and whether or not that's drawing you. And again, I think it's always that interesting thing of where do you start with a story? And I know some people, for example, you, Bonnie, may be like, I really want to write a story set in a particular time period because I feel like people don't know about this time period and I want to highlight it. And so I need to then figure out who's the best character and person to put in that place. Other people might go in with a particular character and then are trying to figure out what's the best time and place. Like, would this story have more bang for buck in the modern day or in a historical period? And when would that matter? And then there's also the last little bit is what are the details? Like, how are they going to get out of certain things, making sure that those are relevant. Anyone else want to chime in with ideas? They're all silent on you, Bonnie.
Say, just to respond to that then, mine is, I'm telling the story of being in communist Soviet Union. It's a middle grade novel of a little Jewish girl and her two friends, and the three different ways they deal with it. The main character, Lena, has drank the Kool-Aid. She loves Russia, Soviet Union, and she's Jewish, but she would never leave. She has a religious friend who is trying to leave, who wants to leave, and then she has another friend who is doesn't care about being Jewish or a member of the Soviet Union. She just wants to go to America. And so I'm really writing about different ways to be free.
Yes.
And what that means, and I'm writing it so that people, for little young kids to understand that there is no one right way. Like, I don't want the propaganda to be the only way that the reader gets to understand the Soviet Union. I want them to see through Lena's eyes why she's so connected. So
yeah, I think that for me, I would probably then set up a thing for each of the characters. Like, what do I think, you know, as kind of Marianne was putting there, like, what is each of those character arcs going to look like? And what is the point, like, you know, as you're talking about the different forms of freedom for them. And if you have key events that you know you want to have happen in the story, and then I probably would dive in to some of that research.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, that takes us to our 10 o'clock hour. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. Hope everyone has a good day. Just a reminder, I am moving on the weekend, so I am in and out a little bit more this week than normal. So if there's something that you're expecting from me or had a question for me, just a reminder, you might need to ask it again because it's very possible it's dropped off my plate. So until then, I will see you guys around. I'm going to stop the recording and then I'll be here for a minute.
Thank you very much, Eileen.
Oh, you're very welcome.